For more than 2 months, brave Iranians of all ages and walks of life have been taking to the streets calling for freedom, equality, and the end of Islamic rule. And for more than 2 months, the regime has been escalating its violent response to the demonstrations. Dozens of protesters have reportedly been killed in the last week alone. Today, the U.S. sanctioned another 3 Iranian officials over the bloody crackdown, and tomorrow the UN Human Rights Council will hold an urgent meeting to consider launching an investigation into the crimes committed in the name of Iran's rulers.
Down with the dictator. That's what Iranians have been taking to the streets for, voicing their anger about human rights violations by the Islamic Republic and demanding an end to theocratic rule. Resistance against the system, however, is something the regime shows zero tolerance for. Its security forces, designed to protect the clerics against opponents, are attacking protesters all over the country. Most violently in the country's ethnic minority regions like Kurdistan or Sistan and Baluchistan.
It seems that as protests have escalated and spread, and actually even smaller towns and villages now joining the protests, the regime seems to be making resorts to more violence, using combat ammunition straight at the start of the protest. And as a result, we have more and more casualties.
More than 300 people have been killed, according to human rights groups, including more than 40 children. In many cases, their relatives are forced to pretend their deaths were accidental. Thousands others are taken away by the security forces and end up in one of the country's notorious prisons, along with other political prisoners like human rights activists Nasrin Sotoudeh or Hossein Ronari, where they are subject to torture, according to family members.
The
Islamic Republic enjoys the silent torture of Hussein and the mental torture of my parents. People are satisfied with the torture. If something happens to my brother, the entire system of the Islamic Republic is responsible.
Often families are not even told where their relatives are or what's happening to them. So some come to the prison every day, demanding information or a release of their loved ones. A release that is anything but certain. Under Iran's Sharia law, protesters can be charged for waging war against God, a crime that may result in the death penalty. Some have already received that verdict.
The aim is to maintain or even build up the barrier of fear that they need in order to rule a country where people don't want them. So that penalty is the most efficient tool to spread fear in the society.
So far, that fear is not putting protesters off. They keep going to the streets, determined to continue until the regime falls.
So more protests triggering more violence, leading to more protests. Kamran Matin is a lecturer in the Department of International Relations at the University of Sussex. And I asked him whether Iran is trapped in a vicious cycle.
Indeed, that's indeed the case up to now, this cycle of violence. The regime hoping that more violence will suppress the protest or scare people off the streets. In particular, Kurdistan has been the site for really unbridled violence by the regime forces for precisely that reason. So far this has not worked, as you also mentioned. A test for the viability of this strategy is a general strike which has been called for by main Kurdish political organization to take place tomorrow across Iran. The intention is to relieve Kurdistan from the massive repression and pressure which is currently under by expression of solidarity by people in other parts of Iran. If that actually takes place to a reasonable extent, I think that would be a milestone in this protest, because it shows that coordination and cooperation between different parts of Iran, different regions, especially a place like Kurdistan, which is politically quite organized, can actually countermeasure, kind of design countermeasures against the government's excessive violence across Iran, and that may change or force the government government to change its calculation in how it is dealing with the protests.
The United States today sanctioned 3 more Iranian security officials. Have the sanctions had any effect so far?
Not really. I mean, many of these officials do not necessarily have to travel or don't travel normally abroad. And as we see, the cost of maintaining this huge apparatus of repression is huge, and the government has been able to pay for it, partly because actually the Russia-Ukraine war has led to the massive increase in energy prices, as we know, which has resulted in an implicit decision by the United States in not fully enforcing its sanctions on oil industry in Iran. There are many reports over since actually the Biden administration came to power that Iran is able to and actually does sell oil to China and other customers on very reduced price, and that is enabling Iran to actually basically finance its repression of the protests. So thus far, the sanctions have not had an effect on the repression of the protesters by the regime.
And tomorrow, Germany will demand an investigation of the crackdown in the UN Human Rights Council. What do you expect?
Well, I mean, from what I have seen in the news, this meeting will look at a draft resolution which demands a high-level international investigation into the repression and crackdown on the protesters. If this is actually approved, I think it's quite a significant move, because that will set in motion a longer process of international United Nations-led investigation into this killing of the unarmed protesters. And given the history of the region in terms of humanitarian intervention, we remember 1991, following the Kuwait War, and how the operation provided comfort to save Iraqi Kurds from the Baas regime at the time. Depending on the scale and the continuation of the protest, some sort of international intervention, or at least exercise of further influence on Iran's behavior, might be on the agenda.
Cameron Martin of the University of Sussex, many thanks.
Thank you.
Day after day, DW's Farsi department has been reporting in depth on the protests in Iran. Censorship and internet blackouts have turned gathering and verifying information into a highly challenging task. But throughout their reporting, another challenge has emerged. They themselves have moved into the focus of the Iranian regime.
For 8 weeks in a row, Nilofar Gholami and her colleagues have been closely following the crackdown on the protests in Iran. Their task? Amplifying the voices of those that the Iranian regime is trying to silence. Today they have received footage of a young woman who committed suicide after having been detained by security forces.
Almost every day we receive video footages from inside Iran, from the streets of Iran. And of course we have some sources, we have some connections, and some reliable sources that publish the videos that recorded by the citizen reporters, because as you know, we don't have free medias inside Iran. So that's the value of the citizen reporters.
With this material, DW's Persian language team produces dozens of videos and articles every day. Thanks to bypass software such as Tor or Siphon, people in Iran can access DW's content, in spite of the regime's efforts to block foreign media.
They try to prevent pictures and images reaching us, and they try to prevent our content to reach people in Iran. But it doesn't work, because what we're seeing is the contrary, that we have a lot more, or even 4 times more reach than we had before the protests began.
But their work comes with the price. DW's Persian language department has been sanctioned with a travel ban by the Iranian regime. Many here still have family back in Iran. They are fearing for their safety. The regime's arm seems to reach all the way to Germany. Some team members have even received personal threats. The threats should be taken seriously, because in the past 43 years, the Islamic Republic has repeatedly attacked its opponents in exile with terror attacks and kidnappings, including journalists and political activists. Imprisoning and torture is part of the regime's daily routine. But this behavior makes me focus even more on my journalistic work and encourages me to be a voice of the people in Iran. Despite threats, sanctions, and internet censorship, they will continue to inform as best as they can about what is happening in Iran. They call it an ongoing revolution that could last for months or even years.
Let's bring in Saeed Golkar. He's an Iranian political scientist and an assistant professor at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. Good to see you. We see every day how the Islamic regime tries to quash internal opposition, but how does it go about Iranian critics outside the country?
Actually, Islamic Republic, as a repressive authoritarian regime, have used the transnational repression from the beginning, from 1979, when they came to the power. They try to maintain the power through the repression of the Iranian inside of the country that is much easier for them, and the repression of Iranian critics and political activists outside of the country in diaspora. They did it in 43 years, without stopping. This is not a new phenomenon. They try to identify the political activists. They try to troll them. They try to scare them. They try to, in some cases, they try to kidnap and kill them. The whole idea is try to keep them silent in order to maintain the political rule.
You say these efforts are expanding. How so?
This is an ongoing process, but whenever the Islamic Republic feels threatened, mostly because of the protests or because of, the revolution that is happening inside of the countries, they are panicking and they try to, extend their own repression, outside and inside of the countries. If they feel not threatened, the level of the repression will drop a little bit, continue for the most active political activists or dissident. But right now, because of the Iranian protest, Iranian Revolution 2022, they are completely freaked out. The Islamic Republic knows that this is a very different situation compared to the other round of the protest. So they are trying to extend and intensify the repression inside of the countries. Right now, we know that more than 70,000 people have been arrested. We know that actually more than 400 people have been killed, according to the official statistic, and outside of the countries. They're trying to send, the threatening email and messages to the Iranian journalists, to the Iranian activists, to academia, to make sure they are silenced in this time of the crisis.
How are dissidents and defectors monitored?
They are using both online and offline technique. Online, they try to hack their online account, Gmail. They try to actually send, for example, phishing email. They try to identify the new activists, especially in 2022. They try to troll them if they are active or if they are teaching in academia. They will try to send the email, cancel their meeting, or they try to push the pressure on these people. And of course, physical surveillance. We know that the Islamic Republic has their own agent, not only Iranian agent. Some of them are the Shia Muslim from Pakistan, from Lebanon, from Iraq, that they are working with the Islamic Republic security forces, trying to identify, and monitor the Iranian activists outside of the countries, and if necessary, try to eliminate them, kill them.
What the picture you're painting sounds like there is no safe place for Iranian dissidents to live. Is it true that the regime will always find them if it wants to?
The regime tried to actually push this idea that there is no safe place. And to be honest, there is no 100% safe place. But we know that the countries that are close to Iran, the neighbor countries, are much more dangerous for the Iranian activists, especially because they are mostly corrupted authoritarian regimes. So when you have a dictatorship in the nearby your countries, it's much easier to kidnap the political activists, especially, for example, in the case of Azam in Turkey, in Iraq, or the Iranian Arab activists in Turkey. Eastern Europe also is not very safe for the Iranian because of the corruption and the lack of the rule of law. West Europe and the United States is much more safe, but as you said, there is no 100% safe place for the Iranian activists.
Saeed Golkar, political scientist and assistant professor at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. Pleasure speaking to you tonight.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.